And it's BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. My guest on the program today is Michael P. Burns, who is the author of the book The Flat Tire Murders, which talks about several different stories connected to some very bizarre homicides that took place in the state of Florida. And today is Tuesday, and this is a serial killer Tuesday where I'm talking about all types of different cases that are related to serial killers. And if you're curious about anything that you would like mentioned on the channel, any particular story, you can put your suggestion in the comments section down below. But first, I would like to welcome Michael P. Burns. How are you doing?
Hi, Ned. Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing well. Hope you are too.
Now, in case someone has not heard of your book, The Flat Tire Murders, would you like to provide a brief introduction?
Sure. In 1975, in Dade and Broward counties in Miami, in South Florida, there were a series of murders involving young women, ranging from the young ages of 14 up to 27, um, all of which, except I think three at this point, are unsolved. And during my investigation into these murders, I uncovered a series of murders that occurred both um, before what is called the canal murders or the flat tire murders in the early 70s as well as in the 1960s. So it's really a summary of some of the chaos that was going on in South Florida in the late 60s and up to the mid 70s.
And if I recall from reading your book, you begin by telling the story of the Miami Strangler, and that is not exactly connected to the flat tire murders because the Miami Strangler operated in a different way, correct?
That's correct. Really, what we have are three sets of murders. The Miami Strangler from 1964 till approximately 1971, which involved a series of homicides in the greater Miami area, um, really ranging in ages from the 20s up to one victim was in the 80s. All women, mostly strangled in their homes, and those murders were identified by law enforcement as well as the medical examiners as sharing certain links. So they got the moniker the Miami Strangler. After that subsided, there was a series of murders in Broward County known as the Gold Sock Stranglings. And again, law enforcement and the medical examiners identified certain patterns that lumped these all in as potentially being the group of the work of one killer, and then the flat tire or the canal murders. So it starts with the Miami Strangler in the 1960s, um, never solved. Very cold cases at this point, approaching 60 years later. So the hopes of solving those cases really is quite dim at this point.
But if I remember, I mean, when I was reading the Flat Tire Murders in the section on the Miami Strangler, I couldn't help but think about some other cases that I've talked about on Black Box Online Radio, and I started using the term serial killer legends. And I don't mean that in any type of glorifying way, but it was more about how are we certain that this was one killer? And when I say serial killer legends, it's almost as if it's a leading theory that a serial killer was responsible for all of these crimes, but there's also the possibility that they were unconnected homicides, or that maybe some of them were committed by one person, others by other people. And is that a fair thing to say, or am I completely off the mark?
No, I think you're absolutely correct, and I think that as we're talking here, that it occurred to me that in the mid 60s, the Boston Strangler was, of course, one of the leading cases in the country, and it sort of brought the notion of a serial killer. Of course, this is in the 60s before the explosion in the 70s, people like Kemper and Bundy. So yes, around that time, the Boston Strangler was sort of the leading murder case or series of murders, and so I would think it's natural that anywhere around the country where you're going to see a pattern happening of stranglings, it's going to get the moniker of a strangler, of identifying one person as responsible when in fact it may not be. Some may be connected, or some may be the work of the same person, some may not. But I think at that point, based on the forensics that were available, the police were sort of doing their best to identify patterns and make the public available, but taking with a grain of salt also that the media is going to give monikers and try to sell papers as well. So it all has to be taken into account.
But a lot of the people who follow Black Box Online Radio will know that I am very critical of these theories when they try to unite a group of homicides under a single serial killer. But when we go forward in your book to the flat tire murders, then, now, correct me if I misstate anything, it gets that name because somebody is perhaps either eyeing down women or maybe even stalking them for a little bit, and then they're deflating the tires in the car so that, the woman has a flat tire and she's just like, oh, what happens? And then through some series of events, the serial killer strikes. And firstly, I would like to know, is that a fair assessment? And secondarily, if that is a fair assessment, even a skeptic like me begins to say, wait a second, that does seem like the same person.
I think you're right. In two of the murders, in fact, for the flat tire murders, only two of the murders involved cars being deflated. But within that small group of murders that involve disabling of a vehicle, there are three that involve the same mall, the 163rd Street Mall, cars being parked there. And then within that larger circle, you have several victims being found in the same canal or general area on US 27, which is a very rural area. So you're starting to see sort of concentric circles and patterns overlap, some overlapping, some not. So it really becomes sort of an enmeshed situation where you're trying to figure out who was involved in what common characteristics. The victims are all white females, age range from the teens to the mid 20s. So they share those common characteristics. So yes, there are certain. I'm hesitant as well to say that this is the work of one person. I think certainly some of them are the work of the same person. How many we just don't know.
Okay, though, but from our correspondences, you did share something with me about how there has been a big development in the investigations with some of these cases. Would you can provide some introductory material about the cases and then talk about the development if you like?
Sure. Up until when the book was published in 2021, only one of the canal murders, and I speak of that's in 1975, approximately 12 to 14 women were murdered during that time, all sharing common characteristics. Again, some similarities, some differences, but um, there was only one homicide that was solved. It was sort of uh, an assault involving a couple that killed the first victim, Judith Osterling. So that was solved in the 70s. The woman confessed, but up until the time the book was published, there was no development at all on any of the cases. And in August of this year, the police in Broward County were able to identify what I believe is probably the killer of the two 14-year-old girls, Darlene Zetterauer and excuse me, Belinda Zetterauer and Barbara Schreiber. They were the victims of a career criminal, no, whose name was Robert Keebler. So that recently was he was recently identified as their potential killer. He's passed away since then, so not much has really come of it since then. But yes, there was a solution to two of those homicides.
And if we can kind of go back to the start a little bit, as I understand, you're coming from California, though, but what made you first curious about these cases that are going on in Florida?
Sure. Well, as I say in the book, I grew up in Miami in the 1980s and 90s, and I've had an interest in true crime. And recently, in 2018, when the Golden State Killer Joseph DeAngelo was arrested for crimes that happened 40 plus years earlier, I was shocked that they finally caught this guy. And before he was caught, there had been a lot of interest in the case online, and it was a really sort of fascinating series of cases that happened from the mid 70s up till the mid 80s. And who was this guy? It was just such a big mystery to finally have this person captured. It was amazing. So that kind of brought my interest into some unsolved cases, and I stumbled upon a series of cases in South Florida where I was from. So that's sort of how the two things met, and I decided to look into it further.
Now, overall, though, do you believe that with the flat tire murders and the murders that we're talking about in the 70s, do you have any idea how many serial killers were operating behind them? Are you really like thinking that one person committed the majority of them, or how exactly would you interpret that evidence?
I'm just as confused as probably law enforcement and everyone else. You can't tell. I think certainly the two flat tire murders were of Ronnie Gorlin and Elise Rapp were perpetrated by the same person, same MO, same location for the bodies, same mall. Certainly, the two teenagers, the case that was just recently solved, were perpetrated by the same person. Apart from that, I don't know. And how many serial killers were operating? This is the era of the Bundys and the Kempers, and probably dozens of others. So I would think probably in that era, based on my suspicion or my gut instinct, probably there were more serial killers operating during that time, simply because there was not the surveillance sort of situation that we live in now with forensics and people being caught early on. Thankfully, I think you could get away with a lot more back then.
Right, because when I was reading your book, I was noticing that some of these crimes seemed very similar and others just seemed like really quite different. Because if we look at the Miami Strangler, for example, you brought up a very good point that one of the victims was in her 80s and was the youngest victim like in her late teens or early 20s or something, was
21, early 20s.
21, yeah. So very, very large age range. And I talk about this a lot on Black Box Online Radio, where I just want to know in these unsolved serial killer mysteries, was there one killer or multiple killers, whether it's the Zodiac, Jack the Ripper, the Long Island serial killer. And from, looking at this story, I was saying, wow, there are all these types of MO differences, differences in the victims, ethnicities as well. And this is the Miami Strangler of the 1960s and into possibly 71. So, what evidence does it really suggest that this was one person?
Well, you mentioned the Zodiac, and it makes me think that, well, what evidence would we have that those sort of disparate homicides across the Bay Area were connected, absent the Zodiac actually letting us know and sort of publicizing himself. Um, what the similarities I would think would be the methods used, strangulation, the fact that they were perpetrated inside the homes, the fact that they share a common grouping in terms of time and location. But apart from that, there are differences, ethnic differences, age differences, and just generally the lack of information that we have, at least for researchers. That's sort of the best we can do at this point, absent records from 60 years ago being produced that would give us some insight. And that maybe was something we can talk about later in terms of access to these records and sort of the frustration I've had in getting some of these records. But we've kind of have to go on the surface level of what we're being told about these cases. So again, it's 50-50. Some could be connected. They all may be connected. None may be connected, but they were certainly identified at that time as having certain characteristics that at least law enforcement felt were sufficient to identify possibly one person.
Well, firstly, to come back to your question about the Zodiac Killer evidence, we're going to have to do some of that at the end because that's a very good challenge question. But to address the issue with the Miami Strangler, yes, I'm just asking a challenge question because, as you stated very clearly in your book, you even had like a map drawn out of like the concentration of homicides. And other than the final crime, the murder of Clara Harmony, who was the final victim in the possible Miami Strangler thing, there's almost a hot zone of criminal activity where the Miami Strangler operated. So yes, I was just asking a challenge question, but that's the beginning. Then we go into the Gold Sock Strangler. Would you like to share more with the audience about the Gold Sock Strangler?
Well, the name of that murder kind of identifies itself. This was a series of murders, um, about four or five of which involved socks being used as the murder weapon. The first couple actually had gold socks, or yellowish gold socks, being used as the murder weapon, which police said, wait a minute, this is kind of similar in what murder weapon is being used, as well as the time frame. So they felt that there was somebody going around with gold socks for whatever reason, and police identified possible psychological issues that the person may have with socks or the color gold, and that kind of became its own thing. But again, this was law enforcement identifying for the public, hey, we may have a person out here that's committing these murders. We want you to be aware of them. And that's how they became the Gold Sock Strangler. It started with a woman named Jonina Kelpian, who was 42, who was found in a very bizarre situation, strangled with a gold sock. And then a couple other murders followed that. Yes, police identified that, hey, there may be somebody out there using this as a murder weapon.
Yes, absolutely tragic, but like, see, when I hear those type of details, that to me sounds like, yes, it's the same killer targeting relatively similar victims using a similar type of method. And serial killers can evolve. I mean, you've already talked about Ted Bundy. You brought his name up a couple times. Ted Bundy didn't commit all of the crimes the same way. And you also
Right.
brought up the Zodiac. Absolutely, the Zodiac didn't commit all the crimes the same way. And sometimes I can even be fooled. For example, recently, we saw the arrest of Rex Heuermann, who's a suspect in the Gilgo Beach killings. Most likely he'll be convicted for it. I just thought that he also. I thought there was one serial killer that had been operating from 1996 to 2010 called the Long Island Serial Killer. But
Mhm.
possibly that could be wrong. I mean, just because there's like the concentration of activity, it doesn't necessarily mean it is one killer. This is some very confusing stuff. But on the notion of confusing stuff, what exactly is your research process for exploring these cases?
Well, initially I started off just finding out what I could on the internet to get an introduction.
Sure.
And then I reached out to several law enforcement, some detectives that were still around and still alive, communicated with them, communicated with probably the top Ted Bundy expert in the country, because law enforcement was, the people I spoke with were clear that they thought that Bundy was involved. So I had to go down that route. So interviews, gathering what I could, certainly newspaper databases, and also requests from public agencies for medical records, police files, some of which came quickly and some of which never came. So that's an ongoing process that I'm still working on.
Okay, excellent though. And you also have a YouTube channel, correct?
That's correct. I post sort of introductory videos on some of the victims, some of the suspects. Probably Ted Bundy is of most interest to people, so I kind of go through um, some of the pros and cons about that particular suspect. So yes, I do, and it's the flat tire murders. I'll be posting additionally, as I get the time. But if people want to get sort of an audio introduction, they can go there and listen to those.
Right. When I was watching the videos on your YouTube channel, I noticed that you talked about, of course, the cases you're exploring. Ted Bundy came up a lot, but also even the Zodiac Killer comes up too, right?
That's correct. You see the Zodiac sort of pop up intermittently in the book, as people are. He was certainly the biggest, biggest name out there in the late '60s, early '70s, and um, they felt that they felt that there were some similarities between some of the activities out in California, as to the activities in South Florida. So his name did come up. So I do talk about the Zodiac. I don't think there's a strong likelihood that, well, I never put anything past anyone, but I think probably that's a bit of a stretch. But certainly some of the similarities or some of the interest in the Zodiac spilled over into the '70s during these cases.
Right, the Zodiac might not be the strongest suspect in these homicides, but you did bring up Ted Bundy, and you said you've gone through the pros and cons. Just in case anyone on Black Box Online Radio hasn't seen your videos, would you like to do some of that now? And I would like you to begin with a particular question. Do you think Ted Bundy should be heavily examined as a suspect in these homicides? And could you walk us through that pro and con exploration?
Sure. Heavily examined, no, but examined, yes, simply because of his mobility, his audacity, quite frankly, when you look at some of his crimes, going up to women in hotel rooms and they disappear. And he was certainly brazen and bold. So the fact that he can travel and the fact he's willing to to pull off these kind of crimes, as well as the fact that law enforcement strongly felt, and I respect the opinions of detectives who've seen way more than I have. I respect their opinions that they think he should be looked at. So I do think he should be looked at strongly. I think there is certainly some doubts that are reasonable to have with him involved. Some of the pros, I guess, for him would be, of course, the detectives feeling that this was his MO, especially the flat tire murders. The detectives that investigated the women who were abducted from the mall with the flat tires felt that this fit his MO exactly. Um, some of the cons, well, he was in Utah at the time. Some of the pros, well, there's kind of a 2 month gap where he didn't really have any activity out in Utah. So could he have gone to South Florida? Maybe. In fact, Ted Bundy has two ties to Miami. He was there in 1968 at the Republican convention as a delegate for Nelson Rockefeller, and he was tried there in 1979 for the Chi Omega murders in Tallahassee in 1978. So he's been in Miami, and the detective, I felt very interested. One of the detectives during his trial in 1979, one of the flat tire detectives, went into his cell in Dade County and asked to speak with him, and Bundy agreed. And the detective indicated, "Hey, we're investigating these two murders in 1975, women's flat tires at a mall." And the detective said it seemed like he knew what he was talking about, and he said, "Well, I'll talk to you after my trial is done," but he never did. So sort of these weird anecdotes about Bundy's involvement are very interesting, I'd say.
Wow, so it actually seemed like he may have been familiar with the crimes. And I mean, I was going to ask you all about his Florida connections because, as you stated, I mean, Ted Bundy's life has been made so public. Yes, he has very blatant public connections. And you mentioned the Chi Omega murders. I would love for you to talk more about that one because that's when we see a very big evolutionary thing with Ted Bundy. And I'm not going to act like I know every single step along the way, but that is when, Ted Bundy would do something that was perhaps one of his most heinous and most vicious acts. And would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, and you mentioned certainly the Chi Omega murders uh, were done by Bundy in 1978 when he was fleeing from Colorado, where he was facing murder charges. He made his way down to Tallahassee, which is where Florida State University is located, and he was on the run from the law. He had no money, he had no job, he was under a false identity. He got a room at a rooming house, and shortly thereafter broke into a sorority house and killed, I think it was two or three women there, brutally beat them with a log, basically. And you mentioned the evolution of his crimes. He went from this very suave, sort of sophisticated killer in the West, but by the time he's in Florida, he's described sort of as just as a savage shark, just sort of swimming around, hoping to grab something. And he's really devolved into sort of just a brutal, not very sophisticated killer at that time. So for him to go from what he was out west, in the earlier years into Florida in the late 70s, it kind of shows his mental state and his personality deteriorating as he got there. So those were the Chi Omega murders in 1978, for which he was convicted, and he was ultimately executed in Florida in 1989.
Now, you use the word devolve, though, but in terms of the evolution of a serial killer, you can correct me if I misstate anything, because I'm not the biggest Bundy expert. But Ted Bundy starts out as what we know as the lady killer, where he makes up the fake stories. Everyone knows the story. He wears the fake cast on his arm. Oh, I need something from my boat. My arm's broken. Can you help me? So he walks over to a woman, and then she walks with him, and then he would usually commit the crime by blunt force trauma. But that's outside, and that's usually a lone female, right? And then with the Chi Omega murders, he's attacking inside, going after women in groups, and I think he went after groups, at least two women at once before, right? But then
Right.
he's inside going after a larger group, more or less turning into this like out of control home invasion. And you did say he's way more savage, almost like projecting out more viciousness, like exporting more ferocity. So, I mean, you use the word devolve, and you're completely correct. But when I think that it can be a little bit of both, and do you think that's a fair thing to say?
Yes, yes. I think certainly the situation he was in, on the run, just his complete the facade that he had before as this law student in a committed relationship is gone. He's a murder fugitive on the run, um, but he still has that desire or that need to commit these horrible acts. I think is sort of symbolic of his mental state, is psyche deteriorating at that time. Um, and I think if that means looking at his involvement potentially in the flat tire murders, I think we can contrast his earlier behavior in Utah, particularly with Carol Durant, where he pretends to be a police officer, tells her that her car's been broken into at the mall. Hey, can you come with me? We need to go fill out a report. She ultimately goes along with him. Sort of a very charming and trustworthy individual, and later on we see this savage sort of foaming at the mouth type killer. So the flat tire murders, I think, kind of do fit his mo, and it is something that I would suspect from someone like Bundy. But putting him in Florida at that time is the tough part.
Now, it's good because you said that it seems someone like Bundy, because the next thing I was going to ask you was, I know that these are unsolved crimes, and I know that it's going to require a little bit of guesswork, but some people like to create certain types of psychological profiles, and more or less looking at the evidence and making an interpretation. Now, you can choose one of the three stories we talked about: the Miami Strangler, the Gold Sock Strangler, or the Flat Tire Murders, the ones in the 1970s, mid 1970s and onward. And what exactly do you think the killer would have been like? How do you think the killer would have approached the victims? Do you think it's like a suave Ted Bundy type, or is it just like someone who's a little bit more vicious and rough? I mean, some serial killers don't even really put on any ruse at all. They just see like a woman and then they just kind of like snatch her and then they just drag her to a location without any of the made up stories. So how exactly do you think the killer is operating? And yes, please choose one of those as an example.
Well, I'll pick the canal or the flat tire murders, and there's something that is really different about that era versus our era, and I talk about it in the book, which is the prevalence of hitchhiking. Young girls, from the ages of early teens through the 20s and 30s, were regularly hitchhiking, and you would see women out sort of on the side of the road. Hey, can I get a ride? And it was a very common thing. Law enforcement was trying to push back against it, but it was ruled that, I think, through some court cases, that you can't really prevent people from asking for rides. So it was a really common thing back then. So picking up a hitchhiker in the early to mid 70s, in the 60s as well, was just such a common thing that it made it a lot easier for someone to get access to a young woman, get them alone in their car, where they have total control over what the destination is. I think looking at the two murders that were recently solved, Zetterauer and Schreiber, they were hitchhiking. They were 14-year-old girls. They got Most likely they got in the car with this man. He probably pulled a gun on them because they were later found both shot to death, dumped near a canal up near US 27. So probably what happened is he picked them up, started driving them. They said, "Where are you taking us?" And pulled out a gun, said, "Keep quiet." And I think at that time, probably the mental state of many victims was, if I just comply, if I just do what they're asking, this will end okay, and my chances of getting out of this are better if I just let them do what they want and don't fight them. So I think that's probably what happened in a lot of these cases.
You mean that like the perpetrator is taking control of them and then he is using threats and he's not exactly being, maybe he's using a little bit of the charm at the beginning, but very early on he is threatening them. And a big thing you pointed out that not all serial killers do is he's transporting them to a different location, right?
Right. And you look at some of the where the victims were found in near US 27 and the canals up there. It's a very desolate, lonely area, even to this day. So I can imagine what it was like, 50 years ago. Getting them up in that area, there's nobody around. There's no there's nothing out there. So Yeah, I do think that that's what was done. And looking at the two murders involving the flat tires, Ronnie Gorlin and Elise Rapp, I think probably what happened was that the tires were deflated. Um, they noticed that their car wasn't, moving, or they had a flat tire, and someone pops up and says, "Hey, I can help you," and they go with them. And once they're in the car with that person, there's probably a weapon, and they're probably taken somewhere isolated. I think that's probably what happened.
Okay, though, another thing that I get very suspicious about when looking at these serial killer cases is we've talked about two murders where the tires are deflated and the women are attacked. Now, a lot of serial killers in that position don't just stop after two victims.
Hmm.
And even in some other cases, like the I-65 killer who has three murders attributed to him, I think that he did more. I don't have an enormous amount of evidence I could bring that into court to examine, but just the fact that, I mean, there's some specific reasons the way he committed his crimes. He seems like a much more serial offender. The same way, if somebody's going to deflate the tires of the car and successfully murder these two women without getting caught, a lot of serial killers in that position don't just stop after two murders. They keep going on and on and on because they're usually a sexually motivated serial killer. Maybe they're not, maybe they have a calculating reason, but usually they're a sexually motivated serial killer who's doing this because of urges. So, I mean, but only two murders have the deflated tires, right?
Right.
That's
And
so.
I talk about that in the book. Doesn't mean that the person stayed in the area. They could have left. And also, I think what the Golden State Killer kind of opened my eyes to is that sometimes they can stop. If the motives are good enough, if the pressure on them is sufficient enough, and they're smart enough to say, look, I can't keep doing this. I think that's what happened with the Golden State Killer, Joseph D'Angelo. He realized he was almost, getting to be about 40 years old. Technology was changing. And if he kept doing this, he was probably going to get caught. It's just really shocking. He didn't get caught earlier, but he was very sophisticated, very athletic. And so I think sometimes they can stop. Sometimes they're arrested. Sometimes they're dead. The man that killed the two 14-year-olds, I haven't looked too much into him, but he had an extensive criminal record. He was in and out of prison. So we kind of know that that some of these may be one-offs. And if it's a serial killer, they may be able to stop. They may be able to relocate. So until we find out, like in the Rex Huberman case, what happened and when, and we can retrospectively put the pieces back together, we're all guessing at this point.
What do you think about the observation and hypothesis that so serial killers might start out if they're male, they're going to start out maybe late teens, early 20s, and then there's the period of activity, which is also called the reign of terror, that can go on maybe for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. But a big reason why a lot of serial killers stop in their early 40s or thereabouts is there's a decline in testosterone, so they have less energy, also less sexual desire if that's an issue, and that is why a lot of people choose to either stop killing or there are very long periods of inactivity. Do you think that that's a reasonable hypothesis or not?
In some situations, yes. I think in someone like Bundy's case, I think no, he probably would have just kept on going, because he almost had, in my interpretation, sort of a death wish, or a fatal desire to keep doing what he was doing, without regard to his own consequences. Someone like a Golden State Killer was, I think, more cognizant of the risks that he was taking, the fact that his body was not as in shape as it was before. Maybe the decline in sexual desire as well may have had something to do with it. So I think, we're all individuals, and so are these criminals that do this. It may be different for everyone's situation.
Yes, and I've talked about Charles Albright on the channel before, the eyeball killer, and I still have trouble believing this. He started committing homicides when he was in his late 50s, at age 57, and that's when his serial killer period of activity started. So I used to be all about that hypothesis that sexual desire, testosterone, energy, and then it goes down. But you brought up Ted Bundy. I think the same thing. He would have continued to commit those crimes because I mean, it's going to affect people in different ways, but there are all types of serial killers that operate into their late 40s and early 50s. I believe the serial killer Albert Fish also did a lot of that, and sexually motivated crimes too. So you just find so many differences in the human body and so on. But right now, at this time, I would like to remind everybody that Michael P. Burns is the guest on the show. He's the author of the book, The Flat Tire Murders. I've used that book as the source material for two episodes here on Black Box Online Radio. One of them is called Who Was the Miami Strangler, and the other was called A Secret Florida Serial Killer. And I invite you guys to hit the like button and subscribe if you're curious about these true crime cases and discussions. And if you would like to help any of these efforts, you can go in the links in the description box and find one for buymeacoffee.com. Buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Every Monday is Zodiac Monday here on Black Box Online Radio, and I understand, Michael, you follow the Zodiac case pretty closely, right?
Yes, I have. Certainly, your channel has been a wonderful resource in terms of updates, digging in, interviewing the experts. That series was really interesting. So yes, the Zodiac has been an interest, especially living in the San Francisco Bay Area, and being able to sort of see some of the places where that activity occurred.
And overall, do you have any comments about the Zodiac Killer? I know you said you mentioned some of it in your book, but like anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, the Zodiac is just a fascinating case. I think whoever this person was really does not fit into the mold of anyone we've certainly talked about today, of a Bundy or a Kemper, or it's just I can't find a motive for what that person did, because it certainly wasn't sexually motivated. It wasn't financially motivated, or to deal with any sort of sex, drugs, and money. I think detectives say are the sort of the three main motives that you look at when someone's killed. I can't for the life of me figure out a motive behind these crimes. They are almost sort of terrorists, sort of think of Northern Ireland bombings, and to send a message or to terrify people. It's a terrorist act, and I can't place that within the serial killer sort of world or milieu. It's just baffling to this day. And if we ever find out who he was or who they were, and that theory, I would love to know what the purpose of this was, what motivated this person.
Absolutely, I would too. But you did ask me a challenge question. How would we know that these crimes were committed if not for the Zodiac bragging about it or taking credit for it? And it's really hard. But I mean, we have multiple eyewitness sightings of a Caucasian male. That's one thing. Multiple eyewitness sightings of a 5'8" male perpetrator, particularly after the Blue Rock Spring shooting and after the Stein murder. And when we look at the height discrepancies, a lot of them aren't too far off. Like Officer Falk saw the Zodiac the same night as the first 5'8" estimate. He estimated to be 5'10". At Lake Berryessa, the Zodiac is wearing a hooded costume that's almost rectangular. They estimated his height to be 6 feet tall, so you can see how that adds a little bit. And I mean, we also know the Zodiac was Caucasian at Lake Berryessa because they saw him put the mask on over. And it's possible that all of that just kind of comes together and they'd be like, hey, there's this Caucasian male who's committing these homicides. Now, would they actually connect all those dots? I'm not sure because well, I mean, there's just not a lot of physical evidence to tie them all together. But when we look at the flat tire murders, we look at the Miami Strangler, the Gold Sock Strangler, and compared to the Zodiac, it seems to me that all of those crimes in Florida that we've been discussing, those are all sexually motivated. Someone who has some type of deviant issue where they want to attack women, they want to abuse women, they want to dominate women, and they're getting some type of sexual fulfillment from that. And now you said about the Zodiac that that doesn't seem to be there. Now, what is going on? We don't know. It's calculated. I mean, that's
Hmm.
my stance on the subject. And it sounds like you kind of agree.
Yes, I do. It's certainly with the ciphers and with the communications to the newspapers, is just it's very calculated, and the crimes were planned out probably well in advance, and maybe rehearsed as well. Whereas you have some of these cases that we've talked about in my book, where it's probably not as certainly not as sophisticated or planned out. It's probably crimes of opportunity, and I don't think the Zodiac was an opportunist. I think it was something that was very well thought out, probably from start to finish, and for whatever reason he stopped or they stopped. Again, that comes back to what we said earlier. Why did these people stop? I don't know, because the Zodiac was apparently not sexually motivated. There was some other motivation behind this person. I don't know what that is.
Okay, we'll have to come back to that one, but I do want to ask you something about that I was listening to on your YouTube channel, and you did bring up the 1966 murder of Sherry Joe Bates in Riverside, California, and that talked about disabling someone's vehicle
Mhm.
so then they could have access to the female victim. Everything that we've said about these flat tire murders is exactly the same, disabling someone's vehicle to have access to a female victim. But the difference is, and yes, of course, you've stated all this previously in your own works, is that in Sherry Joe Bates's case, a wire was pulled from the distributor, but with the flat tire murders, of course, the tires are deflated. So, in that respect, does that seem like the Zodiac Killer to you, the murder of Sherry Joe Bates, or does that seem like somebody else?
I know that the Sherry Joe Bates is a debated topic in the Zodiac world of whether it was or wasn't. I'm kind of on the fence about that. I think it could be. I just don't know if I feel that there's enough, solid physical evidence linking the two. But certainly there's enough, where there's smoke, there's fire. So I think it's very reasonable to look at that as a Zodiac crime. But yes, you do see similarities between the act of disabling a car, either a distributor cap or deflating the tires, and introducing oneself as a good Samaritan to get this person alone. So whether that happened in Sherry Joe Bates' case, we don't really know. And whether that's a Zodiac crime, I don't know if we can really say one way or the other. It's really, like I said, hotly debated. But yeah, there's certainly similarities, I think, in terms of getting access to a victim, and that was what happened there.
It sounds like, though, a lot of the points that you put forward, like when you were describing the Zodiac Killer, seem very much in contradiction to the killer of Sherry Joe Bates. Like, what was the exact word you said? The Zodiac was not an opportunist, but the
Yeah.
person who disables the cars is an opportunist. Was that it?
Well, I think in terms of Zodiac's crimes, I don't think he was an opportunist where he decided on the day of the murders that this is something he's going to do. I think it was probably planned out days or weeks ahead of time. Maybe in the flat tire murders, probably a similar planning, maybe not as extensive, but I think the Zodiac knew exactly what time, what place, what he was going to do, especially with the Lake Berryessa stabbings, where he's kind of stalling for time almost when he's talking with the male victim, and engaging in chit chat. I think he knew sort of moment by moment what he wanted to do, and I could be wrong, but that's just kind of the impression I get, especially with the Stein murder, where he's telling him to go to one location, but they end up at a different location in San Francisco, a little bit farther away. I think that was probably all calculated and not sort of a spur of the moment situation.
Oh, no, those are very, very reasonable observations, and it's a solid theory. But, for like, I would remind the audience that there was a serial killer from Russia called Alexander Pichushkin, known as the chessboard killer. And in his story, he had this plan in his own mind that he wanted to create a plan to murder 64 people for the 64 squares on the chessboard, and he would mark each square with a trophy. Now, he was convicted for 47 murders, but he claimed he actually murdered 61 people, and at the time, he would have been Russia's most prolific serial killer, but he is not by far because he was only convicted for 47 murders. So, serial killers can be very aggressive, but they can also have this type of um, self-designed motive, this reason that's very personal to them. And with the Zodiac, though, I've never seen something like that. Something like that's why he's doing it. We just don't know.
And I've heard the theory that Mount Diablo and the San Francisco location, and you've talked about it, where if it's on a certain particular geographical angle? Was he trying to create something with the different locations? That's reasonable to think as well. And again, once that case is solved, hopefully if it is solved, we'll have a little more insight. I think the Zodiac's probably dead at this point. To have some insight into what the purpose of this was, and maybe I don't think we're really seeing patterns where there are none. I think there are patterns and purposes to what he was doing and when and why. Um, there's just 101 theories about listen to different people, they'll say different things. So I'd like to get to the truth of the Zodiac very much.
Absolutely. And are there any other true crime cases that you follow?
Well, it's been Bundy for a long time, the Zodiac for a long time. And, I go back to Ted Bundy. His story is still being written. Kevin Sullivan was the author I spoke with in conjunction with my book, and he's released, I think, probably four or five. And I remember listening to him, and he said each time I'm done with it, I say, "That's it. I'm done with Bundy. I'm never gonna." And he keeps finding new stuff. He keeps sort of painting a more in-depth picture. So he's still just a terrible terrible person and terrible case to study, but we're still uncovering things about him. The Golden State Killer is fascinating as well, and the Zodiac, I think, certainly are really just true crime mega cases that we would be fascinated to find out the answer to.
Okay, did you say the guy has 5 books out on Ted Bundy?
He's got several. He's got more than one. I think he wrote his first one and thought that was it, and he wrote a follow up and thought that was it. So he's a real nice guy, Kevin Sullivan, and real comprehensive books. And it's he keeps uncovering new stuff. He keeps talking to people that knew Bundy, and again painting a deeper picture of who this person was.
Firstly, it is somewhat of a struggle being a creative type, and even in the true crime world, to think about creativity. I don't know what you're like, Michael, but I can just be like sitting down, got the remote control in my hand, watching TV, maybe eating popcorn. It's like, I just thought of something that I have never thought of in all my years on this planet. Oh my gosh, I got to do something with this. And, like, it can just hit you like a lightning bolt. And it sounds like your friend is maybe in somewhat of a similar mindset.
Yeah, and that's how it was with the book I wrote. It just sort of happened, and once I found out, I thought this is something I want to do, and it just sort of happened, and it happened quickly, and I think yeah, certainly some people are like that, where if that inspiration or that interest hits, you got to follow up on it, and the Zodiac is one of those ones where you can go down so many different paths and make turn minutia into a number of different theories, and it's really just endless possibilities, which is why it's so fascinating.
Yes, though, but some of the serial killers you've talked about, Ted Bundy and the Golden State Killer Joseph D'Angelo, they also had some very traumatic experiences in their childhood. We don't know the Zodiac yet, so we can't say. We don't know the person responsible for the flat tire murders, can't say. But what do you think of this issue of how either unhealed childhood traumas or intense childhood traumas are driving people to kill? And to provide some context, with Ted Bundy, he's actually dealing with somewhat of a betrayal, right? His sister, the person whom he thought was his sister, was actually his biological mother pretending to be his sister, right? And
Right.
and with Joseph D'Angelo, he witnessed the rape of his own sister on an Air Force base in Germany, and because he was like subdued and unable to help her while she was raped by 2 men. And what exactly do you think that is? Like these people who are experiencing these traumatic events, which can include betrayals and neglect and all of that. Do you think that that's a prerequisite to become a serial killer?
I don't know, and I go personally back and forth on the effect of childhood, because for someone like Bundy, there was that betrayal, being born out of wedlock in a very time when that was very shameful, being lied to about who his mother was. But then you look, he had a very loving childhood from pretty much everyone's recollection, that his mother and stepfather and his siblings that he had through them, pretty much had a happy home. He was not abused or neglected. Um, and so I don't know. I don't know what level of importance to place on childhood trauma. Some people go through very horrible childhoods and are fine as adults. But I do think you're right
Yes.
that there is something that needs to be said about childhood trauma. I think the McDonald triad, I know it's been debated back and forth. I think it probably is accurate in terms of identifying certain types of behaviors that may lead to um, psychological disturbances later in life, particular towards violence or sexual violence. So I think that we can identify certain factors and variables, but again, no two are ever the same. So it's important to look at, I think.
And yes, the McDonald triad, you mean bedwetting, starting fires, and harming animals. Like those three components are usually found in a serial killer.
Correct, and it's usually retrospectively looked back at as to what this person was like as a child, and if you can identify those, you kind of can put correlation between those activities and some sort of emotional trauma or psychological disturbance that results later on in violent behavior, sexual violence.
Okay, because like when I would look at some serial killer stories, such as Jeffrey Dahmer or Richard Ramirez, I don't necessarily see an enormous amount of child abuse in their life. Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Now, it's possible there's some stories that have happened, stories about them that I don't know. There's some issues that went on in the house that I don't know about, but it seems more like it's about lack of bonding or not being able to um, interact with their parents. It could be the result of neglect. I mean, it's possible that Richard Ramirez had an abusive father, and that was one reason why he would like to run away and hide in graveyards, and that was exposure to morbidity. But with Jeffrey Dahmer, though, I was just watching a documentary about him available on the Fred and Wrecking Crew channel. Shout out to Jerome. And it didn't seem like he was overly abused. His parents were completely shocked. I don't know if Dahmer ever talked about abuse from his parents or like the lack of bonding with them. It's just quite a mystery.
It is, and from my understanding of Dahmer, his parents had arguments and were not probably well suited for each other, but no sexual abuse, no physical abuse. His father loved him and stood by him. I think he passed away a couple of years ago, but stood by him throughout his imprisonment. Um, and I think early on in Dahmer's life, there was some wire that got tripped in terms of he was fascinated with dead animals for whatever reason that caused some sort of interest in him, and that developed into some sort of sexual interest. But no, there was no from my understanding, no severe childhood abuse. He was just an odd kid that developed an odd interest, and it turned out to be violent, later on. So some cases we can't identify abuse or neglect as being a cause. In some cases, people I think are just born different, and it develops in a very evil way later on.
You mean that like it could be the components such as genetics as well as like brain functioning with neurotransmitters, or maybe when you say born different, this person is acting on their urges, but they don't feel empathy for the person that they're hurting. It's almost like the same way that they are just satiating any other type of urge, and it feels good to them to inflict pain on someone because it's not sending that message to the amygdala in the brain that you should not hurt this person because they have feelings too.
Yes, and I think going back to Dahmer, I think certainly things such as maybe religion and the occult. I think David Berkowitz in New York had interest in the occult. Dahmer had interest in the occult. So whatever factor that plays in, sort of a religious or a spiritual or occult sort of interest may have an impact on someone's behavior or their desires to commit crimes later on. Yeah, I think that there are just so many different factors that each person is subject to.
Now, you brought up David Berkowitz, though, but he dealt with a lot of things, though, that would be quite different than Dahmer. Firstly, not growing up with his biological family, he's adopted. Secondarily, bullied a lot. People would often make fun of him for his body type and not even really being able to form a lot of strong relationships. Now, it's possible that David Berkowitz was a schizophrenic, and that is debated even to this day because his original diagnosis was psychopathy with malingering tendencies, meaning that they think that he's making up a lot of the
Mhm.
schizophrenic symptoms. Everybody knows a story about how he was communicating with the demon that was inside of a dog, the dog named Harvey, and all that. But that's not exactly parental issues, but that's, I mean, maybe the adoption, but that's like things like bullying, not being able to bond with his
Mhm.
peers, lack of social skills, not being able to make friends. And I mean, I went to junior high school. It sucked. It was bad, but I never became a serial killer.
Mhm.
So it's just a mystery.
Right. Yes, it really isn't. We've all gone through, our challenges in life, and some people become more introverted. They feel victimized and they want to become a victim, and some people, want to victimize others. Through the same going through the same kind of situations. I don't know if there's an answer that we can identify, and if there were such an answer, I think we'd perhaps know it by now, but we're still grasping, I think. But I think profiling and some of the arts and sciences of law enforcement are helpful. I just don't know if I would put full faith in everything that comes out of a profile.
Certainly, though, but with a lot of the serial killers we've talked about, particularly the ones in your book, like the Miami Strangler and the Gold Sock Strangler, the Flat Tire Murders, there seems to be something that is quite different, and that is among serial killers like David Berkowitz and the Zodiac. And those people wanted to broadcast their message to anyone who would listen. I mean, Berkowitz and the Zodiac are both writing letters, they're bragging about their crimes, they're inserting themselves into the case, they have the three-way relationship with the media, law enforcement, and the killer himself. But the serial killers that you're talking about are not doing things like that. And what do you think the motivation for them to operate is? Is it just to commit the murder? Do they want to live in the shadows? Do they want this to be like a dark secret and go on with their normal lives? What exactly are you thinking?
I think most criminals and sexual criminals probably are uh, prefer to have their crimes and their activities kept to themselves. It's a very personal thing, especially with someone like Bundy, for example. His One of his statements was, these crimes and these victims, they belong to me. I possess them. They're mine. He did not want to share them, even when his life was on the line in early 1989, and he started to confess, trying to buy himself more time. It was still very painful for him because he didn't want to give up these secrets and these possessions that he had. So for some people, or some of these criminals, it's very personal. It's possessive. They do not want it broadcast. For people like Berkowitz and the Zodiac, I think the opposite. They want the attention. They like to taunt, probably because they've been taunted and bullied. They feel the need to sort of, as the Zodiac said, rub their boo boos in their face of law enforcement. There's also, with the Zodiac, I think the time of the Vietnam War, the counterculture, that may have been a factor that people have not placed as much emphasis on. So I think also the times that we live in are going to have some sort of influence on whether someone broadcasts or keeps it to themselves.
Yes, absolutely, though. And I mean, I think that the only thing we can do is just evaluate the information as well as we can, look at the different sources, comparing and contrasting. But I guess it comes to a certain point where we just have to admit that we might not ever truly be able to start thinking the way that a madman can think, as sad as it is to say.
Right. And I think the best we can do is talk to these people and try to take everything they say with a grain of salt. But of course, I think whatever information can be gleaned from them directly, from family, from friends, I think is important. And I think that's probably the only way we're going to get some insight. We can't get inside someone's head, but that's the best we can do.
Right. And Michael P. Burns, at this time, I would like you to give the audience some another opportunity to hear your final closing remarks about the Flat Tire Murders. How can people find your book? How can people find any of your stuff? Any final send off you'd like to give to Black Box Online Radio?
Yes, and thank you again, Ned, for having me on, and for Black Box Online Radio, which is a great resource for people that are interested in true crime. Thank you again for having me on. My book is The Flat Tire Murders: Unsolved Crimes of a South Florida Serial Killer. It is available on Amazon, Kindle, hardcover, published by McFarland Press. The book came out in 2021. I have a Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, various under Flat Tire Murders. You'll be able to find me there. And again, it's great to be able to discuss this case in this book with you.
Michael B. Burns, thank you so much.